Media richness theory is a framework used to understand how different communication media, for example, in-person meetings compared to emails, compared to phone calls, how those different channels have different abilities to convey a message or the information sent through it. The theory was put forward by Daft and Lingle in 1986 as an extension building from information processing theory. Daft and Lingle's media richness theory suggests that different communication media or channels can be ranked and evaluated in terms of their richness for the potential information carrying capacity. For example, they would classify emails as lower in richness than in-person meetings because emails do not include body language or tone of voice in the same way that an in-person meeting would have. However, in the past few years and even before the pandemic, but especially after the pandemic started and huge numbers of students and employees began working and communicating almost entirely or exclusively remotely, so even before that, researchers and people in the field have begun questioning whether the general assumption of media richness theory that in-person communication is the richest or best communication medium is still an appropriate conclusion, because we have obviously developed a lot more significant and advanced technology than was available in 1986 for remote communications, and people's level of comfort with those also has increased. So the two considerations with media richness theory, first is the channel and its ability to convey more or less complex information, and then the complexity of the topic or the content of what you're trying to convey to someone else. So a low complexity topic or content message would be things like routine situations or situations where all parties have access to the information. And the media richness theory would suggest that in such cases you can use channels low in information richness like email or a memo, because the uncomplicated nature of the message will still presumably get conveyed. In a high complexity topic or content, these things would be like unusual situations or occurrences, or those requiring multiple people to address an issue, and arguably also when there's psychological or emotional complexity to the situation. So someone's feelings are going to be hurt, or someone's going to get negative information, then even though the content of the message itself might not be very complicated, the emotional or psychological quality of it is. And in such cases, media richness theory would suggest that you need a channel that allows for more information richness. Again, however, I think it's important to recognize that media richness theory has been called into question as technologies continue to advance, and we've had social things going on in the social environment that have changed the way that we communicate with each other. And this is an article even before the pandemic called Revisiting Media Richness Theory for Today and the Future. And I just listed the abstract there if anyone is curious about it and wants to go look at that for their case study or some other reason. With regard to the different channels, face-to-face communications, these are just some qualities of the different kinds of channels that a lot of people bring up when discussing this theory. So face-to-face communications typically are the highest in information richness. They provide audio and visual stimuli. Feedback between the sender and receiver is immediate, and it has more of an intimate and personal feel. With a phone call, there's no visual cue, so no body language, although there still is, tone of voice or that aspect. And it does allow for personal and rapid feedback, so immediate synchronicity, if you will, between the sender and receiver. With written communications, feedback is often delayed, so it's more asynchronous, and you lose nonverbal, that aspect of the communication, although, with emails and texts, we have, you could say, adapted to this by using emoticons or other means of injecting emotion or intended emotion into a message. And formal communications like a memo or a newsletter may be one way, so you're not really able to get the feedback of whether the person even received it or if they understood the message that you intended. Other things to consider with email communications. Email can be monitored by your employer. Many times employers will require any emails sent that involves work topics that you are sending it through their server and their system. And messages you send and receive are official documents of the organization which may be stored. There's benefit to that, certainly when compared to an in-person meeting, when you might not have taken notes afterwards and forget the details of something that was discussed. With an email communication, you can take the time to frame what your message is, so it's more precise than an in-person conversation would likely be, and then people can go look up the details of that conversation later. With online message or discussion boards, some important points to remember that there are often permanent records of statements posted, even if someone goes back and deletes them. And people, especially if there are other people on the discussion board that you've never met before, then people have limited information by which to judge or assess the accuracy of or validity of someone's statements or what the intentions were. So miscommunications can be common in these kinds of forums, which I'm sure all of you have witnessed on social media platforms before, where things break into ugly discussions. So communication networks can be formal versus informal. And the formal communication channels are those that are officially established and sanctioned by the organization. So those are the official, like in the organizational chart, the channels or paths through which communication flows. Informal includes, it looks more like a network. We'll look at a picture in another slide. And direction of communication can be upward through the org chart, downward, or horizontally or laterally. So here's an example of a formal communication channel that as depicted by an organizational chart. So lots of up and down or lateral communications, and not seeing a lot of network patterns there. Horizontal communication, also called lateral or sometimes crosswise communication, tends to be particularly common in lower levels of the organization. It involves solving of a problem or sharing of information, or sometimes coworkers trying to coordinate their work and efforts, or perhaps resolve a conflict. Examples of common upward communications would be progress reports from individuals or teams to a manager, problems or complaints about situations that arise on the job that the manager might not have directly observed or encountered, requests such as requesting a change to one's schedule or asking for a raise, or a request to work remotely rather than on site. Common downward communications include like meetings led by managers or town halls by executives. Company handbooks or policies also would be a form of downward communication, as would newsletters or memos that the company puts out. Information conveyed in downward channels often involves specific instructions or directions to employees about their jobs or information about the overall organization's goals and performance. Feedback to people, either individuals or teams, also typically comes in a downward communication form, although lots of organizations also do peer feedback evaluations, which would be a form of horizontal communication. So this is an example of a much more informal communication or social network than was depicted a couple slides ago in the hierarchical organizational chart. And researchers have become increasingly interested in social network analysis, so looking at people's informal social networks, who they have access to or influence on. And some of the early research in this area was used to identify the NSA to identify connections or linkages between different individual terrorists or terrorist groups. This is an interesting video. It's optional you can access the link if you download the PowerPoint through Canvas. He talks about how social networks predict epidemics. We mentioned at the beginning that one of the goals of communication might be to persuade. So informing, connecting with others, or persuading. And these three elements here are commonly identified and discussed as features of a message or the speaker that influence how persuasive a message will be. So first is ethos, which is the personal credibility of the speaker. Pathos, this would include emotional appeals in a message. A lot of advertising has this. Logos that would be a logical argument supporting a position. So using data or information and logical reasoning, inductive or deductive reasoning. Another video that I'd like you to watch is one that includes Robert Cialdini's research on persuasion. So this is a short video. It's listed as one of the steps in the module. And I think you'll find some of the research that he cites interesting in how to make messages more persuasive. Storytelling is another way in which communication occurs, and it can be very powerful in terms of convincing people, informing people, and convincing, persuading, as well as forming connections between people and bonding them to the organization. So storytelling can be used as a means of conveying or reinforcing organizational culture. Stories can be told which help to convey or reinforce their mission or their purpose. So why do they exist? And to build emotional connections or bonds. So another one of the videos I'd like you to watch this week involves the importance or role of storytelling in workplaces or organizations.